be giving us a download on several of the issues confronting us these days. The first one of which, Steve, is, of course, on the headlines now in the major media, which is quite surprising. It appears that the objections to your long-standing investigation into the Wuhan lab and as being the origins of the China virus are now being withdrawn because of essentially massive evidence. Tell us about it.
Well, it's kind of validation for me, Chris, because back in February of last year, I was one of the earliest ones to say this was probably a laboratory creature, a result of reckless gain-of-function experiments that created a highly dangerous pathogen that somehow escaped from the lab. Of course, I also mentioned the other possibility that it was a deliberate attempt by the Chinese military to genetically engineer a bioweapon that could be used to attack China's enemies. And of course, we are the paramount enemy of the United States, but China thinks of itself as surrounded by enemies, Japan and India and the rest, that they would not hesitate to unleash a bioweapon on. Now, until recently, mentioning either possibility was enough to get you banned from social media and dismissed by the mainstream media as a paranoid crank. I was actually banned. My article in the New York Post, fourth largest newspaper in the United States, was actually banned by Facebook. It was taken down by the 20-somethings, the know-nothings really, who run Facebook and who serve as fact checkers. I was taken down for 2 months, and finally we were able to get it back up again. Well, now Facebook, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, everybody else is now admitting that, yeah, it probably did escape from the lab. And they're even willing to say, now beginning to say that China does have a bioweapons program. Well, we know that China has a bioweapons program because guess what? A few weeks ago, we found a smoking gun. We found an article dated from a few years ago where Chinese scientists discussed fighting World War III with bioweapons. All right. So it's not, paranoia, as the old joke goes, if they're really out to get you. And as I've described in my work over the years, most recently in Bully of Asia, the Chinese Communist Party is really out to get us. I mean, they're really determined to replace America as the dominant power on the planet. And so it really doesn't require much of a leap of the imagination to think that that same regime that brought us forced abortion and sterilization, that same regime that brought us is bringing us now in real time forced organ harvesting of the Uyghurs in the far west, a genocide in real time against the Uyghurs. It really doesn't require much of a leap of the imagination to say that they would hesitate to develop deadly bioweapons or release them upon the world. And their military strategists, it's now clear, were planning to do just that. We have a report out of Australia from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that has done the world a favor. It has discovered a Chinese document that proves that Chinese military scientists were working towards the development of what they call a new era of genetic weapons. These weapons, the paper describes, quote, could be artificially manipulated into an emerging human disease virus, then weaponized and unleashed. Let me repeat that. These bioweapons could be artificially manipulated into a disease virus, then weaponized and unleashed. And we have a copy of the paper in Chinese. It's called The Unnatural Origin of Sars and New Species of Man-Made Viruses as Genetic Bioweapons. And the paper begins quite boldly by saying that World War III would be fought with biological weapons. And not just any bioweapons. They actually talk about coronaviruses. We all know a lot about coronaviruses now because we've been living with a coronavirus pandemic for the last year and a half. They talk about the fact that coronaviruses, which cause respiratory illnesses in people, were a favored class of viruses. They're a class of viruses that could be readily weaponized. In fact, the Chinese scientists in this paper, Chris, were even more explicit. They pointed out in their paper that the coronavirus that causes SARS, which is sudden acute respiratory syndrome, was an ideal candidate for a bioweapon. Well, guess what? COVID-19, the China virus that causes the Wuhan flu is a type of the SARS virus. That's why we call it SARS-CoV-2. And now you understand why the head of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a guy named Peter Jennings, not our old broadcaster, but the executive director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, described the new document as the closest thing to a smoking gun that we've got. It clearly shows that Chinese scientists were thinking 6 years ago about the military application for different strains of the coronavirus and thinking about it, how it could be deployed against peoples around the world. So, and Peter Jennings says, it begins to firm up the possibility that what we have is the accidental release of a pathogen for military use. Yeah. Well, I think this explains a lot. I think that the China virus, its origins as a bioweapon, explains why China has blocked investigations, right? If this was a simple case of someone getting a bad bowl of bat soup, right, they'd be happy to have foreign investigators in to investigate the origins, to clear them of the charge that this was a bioweapon. But they've kept us out. We've had the opposite of that. We've had a shutdown. So, this comes on the heels of the Deputy National Security Advisor, Matthew Pottinger, saying that the Chinese People's Liberation Armies have been carrying out biological warfare experiments in Wuhan for years. It comes on the heels of the fact that David Asher, the former lead investigator for the State Department, said that it was the result of research that the PLA was doing on a bioweapon. A lot of people are now saying, including Mike Pompeo, who last May said that, this probably came from the lab, and he was hammered relentlessly by the left-wing media, the mainstream media. That's really a synonym for saying that. But it's clear now that the PLA has been carrying out biological warfare experiments in Wuhan for years, and this came from the lab, and it was part of a military bioweapons program. So that's where we are. That's where we are today. And even one final point, even Joe Biden's Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, had to admit a couple of weeks ago that that one of the two possible explanations for the origin of the China virus is escape from the Chinese biolab in Wuhan. So even they're being forced to admit that the evidence is really overwhelming, that we're dealing with a lab creature, a dangerous lab creature, part of the PLA bioweapons program. And I think it was a bioweapon in development.
Well, it didn't take them long, even if it was an accident, to see the strategic advantages. What happened in Hong Kong? Would it have happened, do you think, if the COVID hadn't tied the hands of the world?
Yeah, they certainly sought every possible advantage from the pandemic that they unleashed on the world. And I believe they deliberately unleashed it on the world. I mean, this is a topic we've talked about before. They let the planes continue to fly out of Wuhan to places like Milan and Paris and London and New York and San Francisco, even as they closed down flights within China itself. So it was a lab creature. It was part of a bioweapons program. When it got out of the lab, it was the Chinese people were deliberately used as vectors to take the disease to all parts of the planet. And China knew what it was doing, because even in the early days, they were out buying up PPE, protective gear. They were out buying up masks and stockpiling them, because they knew what they had unleashed on the world, and they knew they could make a turnaround profit. It's estimated, Chris, that they made over $10 billion in profits from reselling masks and PPE that they had purchased in Australia and in Spain and in Italy, brought back to China and then reshipped to those countries when the pandemic reached dangerous proportions. I mean, it doesn't get any more despicable than that, I think.
Well, you're moving towards another dimension here, but speaking of meddling with bat cells and the SARS virus, the University of Pittsburgh, I noticed this morning, has been revealed to be using, with essentially funding from a unit of Dr. Fauci's operation,
Yeah.
actually meddling with human fetuses, aborted fetuses, and as far as I can tell, using them in experiments for mixing with other animals. And I'm not sure where to go with that, but what do you know about it?
Well, this is probably some of the most upsetting news that I've heard in a long time, and I've been in the pro-life movement now for almost 4 decades. In December, LifeSite News reported the University of Pittsburgh had been conducting medical research by grafting scalps from aborted babies onto rodents. All right. Now, think about that. Human beings are created in the image and likeness of our Heavenly Father. They should be treated with dignity at all stages of their existence, from conception to natural death. They should not be used in experiments, creating chimeras that, animal human hybrids. Taking a scalp from an aborted baby and grafting it onto a rodent to do some sort of Mengelian kind of ghoulish experiment is revolting on the face of it, and an insult to human dignity. But that's just really the tip of the iceberg, because we're talking not just about aborted baby scalps. We're talking about their organs transplanted. We're talking about livers harvested from live babies. You see, because in order to get the organs and the scalp and the skin and the corneas and the lungs and the hearts alive, you have to abort the baby when it's alive. You have to dissect it. You're engaging in vivisection. I mean, you're killing a tiny human being for their organs. I mean, this is something that I would expect is going on in China, where they have no ethical standards, where the Chinese Communist Party is quite proud of the fact that it believes that human beings are just animals and they can experiment freely with them. But we should hold our own scientists to a higher standard. I'm afraid that Dr. Fauci, who describes himself, who was raised Catholic, by the way, but describes himself now as a humanist, has completely forgotten the dignity of human beings, and is abiding by the rule that, if we can do the experiment, we should do the experiment, but there have to be limits. I think Bishop Joseph Strickland of Tyler, Texas, our friend down in Texas, put it very, very clear when he said, quote, "These kinds of things are crimes against humanity that should be prosecuted. Silence in the face of these atrocities simply adds to the evil. Wake up, America. Demand that this stops now." That's Bishop Strickland. And I think we should add our voices to his demand that this stops now. These babies are being aborted alive and subject to vivisection and organ harvesting. It's as bad as anything that's happening in China.
With that in mind, do you think there is any scintilla of possibility that the Biden administration will act on this?
No, I think the Biden administration has gone over a cliff when it comes to the whole abortion question. I mean, regardless of whether you look at reasonable restrictions on abortions, such as waiting periods or required ultrasounds, they're opposed to everything. They want abortion on demand through the point of parturition. They want abortion on demand up to the point of childbirth. And they really don't regard the unborn child as a human being. And so I think they're perfectly all right with these kinds of Mengelian, disgusting experiments on human beings, living human beings. I mean, there's actually a video where you can see the premature baby, which is aborted alive via labor induction. And then you see the umbilical cord moved off to the side as the living baby, is cut open to harvest the liver. Who does that kind of thing? And we know the babies can feel pain post 12 weeks gestation or so. And these are babies that are 15 weeks, 16 weeks, 17, 18 weeks along. I just, as the father of a large family, I just find this incomprehensible that we would be doing this. And don't forget that these experiments cost money. And someone is paying for this kind of experimentation, these kinds of crimes against humanity. And who's paying for it? You're paying for it, and I'm paying for it, and every American that pays taxes is paying for this kind of reckless, inhumane experimentation. And finally, you've got the human trafficking aspect of this, because you've got the local Planned Parenthood clinic probably providing some of these live babies for the experiments that are being done at the University of Pittsburgh. Much more investigation needs to be done about this. The funding should be cut off immediately. And I would say that, as much as we should hold Dr. Fauci responsible for continuing to fund the Wuhan lab and reckless gain of function experiments in China, and he should be held, they should be held responsible for all of the sequelae of that. They should also be held responsible for this. These are crimes against humanity, and they must stop. There must be an outcry across the United States.
Well, one might wait for the Pennsylvania legislature to move on its state university. In other states, the Supreme Court has just decided to take on a case that might well punctuate and puncture the liberal interpretation of Roe v. Wade and Roe v. Wade's flawed interpretation of the Constitution itself. What do you think is going to happen with that?
Well, I've been waiting for such a case for a long time, and I have to say that it couldn't come at a better time, at least looking at the composition of the current court, because thanks to the Trump administration and to the fact that President Trump kept his promise when it came to appointing pro-life judges to the federal bench and to the Supreme Court, we now have Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. We have Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. We think we have a pro-life majority, even without John Roberts, who has become unpredictable in recent years. So the court announced just earlier this week that it would hear a case involving a Mississippi law, and they will decide whether or not states can pass laws that protect life from abortion before an unborn baby is viable. Now, currently, after viability, of course, which is currently said to be around 22, 23 weeks, although some babies at 19, 20 weeks have survived, after viability, under current Supreme Court rulings, the states can pass laws regulating abortion. But this would be an opportunity to move up the standard, to improve the standard. The Mississippi law, I think, is 15 weeks. That would be a gain another month or two of protection for unborn babies once they reach 4 months gestation, roughly 3.5. Of course, we need to move it up well beyond that. We need to move it up to conception, actually. But if the Supreme Court is willing to hear this case and willing to rule in favor of the Mississippi law, then another thing that we've been pushing for a long time, and that is heartbeat bills. Heartbeat legislation now has been passed in close to a dozen states, or is under consideration. That heartbeat legislation, which forbids abortion after a fetal heartbeat can be detected, might well survive Supreme Court scrutiny too. So I'm very hopeful now that the reconstituted Supreme Court, with the great pro-lifers that now sit on the bench, will allow the states to do what they should have been able to do for the last 50 years, and that is pass laws forbidding abortion.
Well, the Supreme Court, since Roe and even earlier cases, obviously assumed for itself not only the interpretation of the Constitution, but as Earl Warren said in 1958, the Constitution is whatever we say it is. And that actually began back in 1903 when the governor of New York, who eventually became the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Charles Evans Hughes, under FDR, he, as governor of New York, said that, hey, the Constitution is what we say it is, and we are pledged to defend it. When he was taking his oath of office as governor, they're going to defend the Constitution, but as they see it. And this notion of liberality is what's really at the bottom of the contention among the constitutionalists versus the progressives surrounding the Supreme Court. Most of these fellows, even Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Alito, went to schools where the professors were all progressives and encouraging not the study of the law, but sociology, psychology, and all sorts of other enlightening issues which could be brought before the courts as constitutional arguments. Now, they've been stuck with that for years, and I'm delighted to see. I'm not surprised about Amy Barrett, but I am surprised that finally the issue has crystallized to the point where people call it by its proper name.
Yeah, and I think people also need to understand the big picture here. And the big picture is that 90% of countries worldwide have laws limiting abortion at earlier than 15 weeks, like Mississippi's. France, Germany, they all limit abortion to the first 10 or 12 weeks of pregnancy. Britain goes a little further than that, but we're one of only 4 countries that allow abortion on demand throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. And guess who 2 of the other 4 countries are? North Korea and China. That's not an association that we should be proud of. So the reality is, I think that the overwhelming majority of Americans support strict restrictions on abortions. And as we continue to move the bar closer and closer towards conception, we have to keep in mind the ultimate goal is to make abortion at any stage in pregnancy as reprehensible as slavery is.
Well, the lesson we should all learn from this, and Trump understood it right from the starting gate, elections matter. It's sad that in the last 20 years or so, whenever a decision comes down from a federal court at any level, immediately you look up the judge to find out who appointed him or her.
Yeah.
And it's not the way the law ought to work, but it's the way the nominations came to pass. And sadly, the results of those kind of cases and the folks on the Court of Appeals, where few cases actually arrive because of the cost, they say 80% of these, everybody across the board has no dog in the fight. We're really looking at the fundamentals of, securities law and so on. But when it comes to the 20% of the cases that are about guns or about abortion or about family or education, then the abyss is more evident. And unfortunately, you almost find unanimity among Democrat appointees with very little alienation from the party line, much more so than the Republican appointees, who take the law seriously and look at it from their point of view jurisprudentially and disappoint us from time to time because their notion of jurisprudence grants to this party or that party the power that we think the Constitution doesn't confer in the first place. So we're stuck, but it is delightful to see a court willing to take this on in public. It'll probably come up next fall or winter. They're going to have to, Mississippi will come to the Supreme Court and defend its law, which is not possible very often, and I hope they do a good job of it. A lot will depend on their counsel and their arguments, but clearly we understand the basic principles at stake.
We do, and if the Supreme Court uh, abandons its viability standard and allows the states to regulate abortions, regulate them out of existence earlier on in pregnancy, we will have states that restrict abortion to the point where they become practically non-existent. We will have states where not a single abortion clinic is still standing and operating. We will have large parts of the United States that over time become abortion free. Now, we'd like to, of course, end all abortions overnight. And if I had the power to do so, I would so decree. But as a practical matter, we're probably going to be in this fight for some years to come. But the fact that the Supreme Court has now taken, I think, the most important pro-life case in the last 20 years, and it's now on its docket, is very, very exciting for me. And we'll all be watching very closely in the months to come as the court hears the arguments pro and con. And we should all be praying for a favorable ruling, because a lot of babies will be saved, and a lot of mothers and fathers and families saved from the trauma of abortion if they make the right decision.
Well, there's lots to pray for. I know that the law is supposed to be instructive and educational and embody the highest principles of the community. Those principles these days are in dispute right down to the core realities. And I pray that when we finally start succeeding and fighting for life, that the instructional dimension of those arguments will be able to seep out into the public, in the schools, and even in the media, which now, sadly, don't reflect much sympathy for the unborn child.
Well, that's why we're doing these broadcasts, because we can no longer count on the mainstream media, on the old line media, to tell the truth about our institutions, about our values, about the views that most Americans still hold dear. With the mainstream media, for example, won't tell us that a law like Mississippi's is not just about protecting unborn children, although that's its primary goal. It's also about protecting women, because women deserve real health care, not dangerous procedures that are unnecessary and devastating. Think about the risk of death, of illness, psychological trauma that late-term abortions cause. Women face a higher risk of, if they have an abortion at 4 months or higher, they face a higher risk of a hysterectomy, reparative surgery, a blood transfusion. The risk of women dying due to abortion increases exponentially. So this is about protecting women, protecting them both, loving them both, the mother and her unborn child. And I'm sure that most, knowing Mississippi, I'm sure that most Mississippians agree, but I think most Americans agree with that common sense approach as well. And certainly most countries around the world agree, because that's why they have laws forbidding abortion, either entirely or beyond some early point in pregnancy. So let's hope that that's the direction that our country is moving in. We have sacrificed tens of millions of unborn children on the altar of abortion over the last few decades. It's time for that slaughter of the innocents to come to an end.
Well, that's a very appropriate ending to this interview. Our conversation here will continue, and another Friday from the Population Research Institute in Front Royal. I've been here as your host, Chris Manion, on the premises of PRI, and we've been talking with PRI President Stephen Mosher. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and I'm reminded that hope is a theological virtue. I pray that we can be optimistic as well. Thank you, Steve.
Amen, Chris.